good afternoon, evening, morning, guys, wherever you're joining from today. Join myself and Michael Finocaro for episode 2 of season 1 in the Crowd and Not Clouds crowd. So in season 1 last week, in episode 1, sorry, last week we went through an introduction into PLM, what PLM is, covered some of the history in PLM, differences between SaaS, PaaS, and how the industry's evolved. So we're going to similar structure to last week, as Michael said earlier. I'm going to throw some points out to you guys during the webinar in terms of polls. So input on that would be greatly appreciated. And then we'll also have a Q&A at the end. So please jump on the chat function at the bottom.
Hopefully we don't look as disheveled as the guys from the IT crew.
I'd hope not, yeah. So we're going to start off with a poll, guys. So the first question for you guys is, why aren't people using PLM on the cloud yet? Is it due to not using cloud services at all? Are you using Salesforce on the cloud but not PLM, or are you fully on the cloud already?
The two cloud crowd. Cool. Pretty even, actually, in the responses, isn't it?
It is fairly even.
Let's try to get at least, well, come on, there's 22 attendees, so we should get at least 20 answers, right? So yeah, the not to cloud crowd, Salesforce, but not PLM, or in the two cloud crowd. 16 people so far. Give another minute. Yeah. Okay, fantastic. Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Fantastic. So there we go, guys. Reasonably split. Some people still on Salesforce. So based on the fact that still some people using Salesforce, why do you think they're not using PLM on the cloud, Fino?
I gave the question actually quite a bit of thought. I think that there's really a lot of inherent differences between CRM and PLM that sort of explains that. For instance, when you look at a CRM system, the data complexity is relatively simple. It's people, it's sales numbers, and things like that. Whereas in a PLM system, it's super complex. We have 2D data, 3D data, BOMs, complex relationships. Also, the data formats are different. In CRM, it's typically just the equivalent of Excel spreadsheets, whereas in PLM, I've got again, different formats of 3D data, Word and PowerPoint and Excel, and really heavy files and stuff. The relationships with the objects in CRM are relatively flat, whereas in PLM, particularly when you're doing product structure and then how the product structure relates to the BOM and how the EBOM and the MBOM are related, you started getting into really, really complex relationships between things. CRMs are more or less transactional systems. I mean, they do, Salesforce does have chatter, so there is a bit of social piece of it, but really the core value of PLM is about collaboration, and that's not really a major feature of CRM. Another difference is the use of 3D data in a CRM system. The 2D data is used, but 3D data is used, but more or less for analysis. If you look at Salesforce purchase of Tableau, they do some really cool 3D graphics, but it's really a special case. Whereas in PLM, I mean, particularly when we're doing mechanical design, we're using a CAD system. Many of the users are using a CAD system a lot of times during the day. So of course, data replication also. I mean, CRM typically doesn't require large downloads in order to look at an object, whereas in CAD, when we're using CATIA or NX or Creo or SolidWorks or whatever, we're typically loading up these big assemblies and typically want to replicate the data close to the users because otherwise it'll take them hours to get in. And lastly, I'd say that in terms of external integrations, CRM is mostly integrating just to similar systems, eventually maybe a point of sale, but typically ERPs, whereas PLM is also connecting to ERP and maybe sometimes to a CRM, but then we got all these other connections to all these CAD packages I mentioned, to MES systems and to IoT systems and more. So I think that one of the reasons Salesforce is on the cloud is that is because the data model is a lot different, and I think the PLM just inherently is a different animal, a more complex animal, and that's some of the reasons why cloud is, PLM has been held back in terms of the cloud, Simon.
All right, fantastic. Cheers, for some really good points there. So for those people that aren't in the T-Cloud crowd, why is it that people are hesitant to move? So I'm just going to throw up another poll for you guys now. So is it due to data security concerns, network constraints, possibly some vendor lock-in in terms of contracts, or something else? Other?
Great. I'm glad people are answering.
Yeah, flying in.
Sorry, I got to put my glasses on. I got to be able to read the tiny text on this. Yeah, I'm expecting that security is going to be the number one, and it looks like I'm not completely off. But we still only have 43% of you voting. So, oh no, less than that, 20, 50, oh, 58%. Anybody else want to vote? Okay, another one. So, okay, so it looks like about half the people are concerned about security, and there's still network concerns of vendor lock-in and then other issues. So that's what we're going to do in this webcast. We're going to try to talk about all of these things to some degree.
Yeah, so security is the first one to cover. Obviously, it's paramount to a lot of businesses and professionals in the IT space. And are the misconceptions and fears that people may have, are they real, and should they be worried about it, Fino?
Well, I'd say that, so I've got two parts of the slide. So let me talk about the left side. I just put 6 of the more common kinds of attacks a company can face by hackers. And as you can see, most of them can also happen on cloud or on premise. The one thing that cloud gives you an advantage is that a physical attack on a physical machine is nearly impossible, because the data centers of AWS and Azure typically are more or less impossible for a mortal to enter. So I would argue, and many would argue, that your data on the cloud is at least as secure as it is on premises. I also put some of the threats. The thing is, another thing to remember too is that a large majority of the hacking, I don't know the exact number because of course it changes and people aren't always going to admit that they've been hacked, but a vast majority of that is internal hacking. It's just disgruntled employees or corrupt employees. Like I can give one example. If you guys remember the Galaxy phone, when the battery was blowing up, a friend of mine actually found the cause of that, and it was somebody had actually stuck a USB into one of the NC controller machines on the floor of the Samsung factory. They had introduced an instability in the battery, so at a certain temperature level, it would explode. So it's really, even on-prem, you can be vulnerable. Another example, I was in China at Chengdu at a customer, and the machine room where the production server was running, that was basically for they put them on dams, so lots of water behind walls that could crush villages. The whole center was just on the other side of a door, which was open with ashtrays on the top. So, I don't think you're going to see that in Amazon. And so the other aspect, of course, is how do you fight those things? In the case of on-prem, primarily you use firewalls and VPNs in order to get around that, to counter that. Some customers, not all, but some can go through the idea of doing an ISO audit or a SOC audit, which is either the ISO, an ISO auditor comes in, and that's the ISO 27001-2013 standard, or a SOC 2 Type 2 audit. That's actually a standard thing that all the cloud service providers, the CSPs, do anyway. And as you see here, this is not a, this is more of a rough idea chart, but the idea is that for a lot of these threats, a solid ISO SOC certification can be an effective countermeasure. The other term that maybe you're not familiar with on here is OWASP, the Open Web Application Security Project, which gathers regularly the most common, they have a top 10 list of the most common vulnerabilities in software. And so typically all the vendors I've talked to for this session have read that list very, very deeply and ensured that the different vulnerabilities there are exposed. So at the end of the day, it's really a function of the software that it's secure, and that your infrastructure and the network getting to that infrastructure is secure. And so I think you can argue that your data is equally secure on premise and on cloud based on what I just said. Another aspect of security is espionage. Unfortunately, you can never really be 100% secure because they could even have government agencies that could be trying to hack your data. And so there's lots of ways of countering that. So you can encrypt the data as it's traveling from the user to the server. You can encrypt the communication between different components of the web, which I called here Web Connect. You can encrypt the data once it's sitting on a disk. You can use a DRM to secure the documents so that they have an expiration date or they can be only read by certain people. You can use SAML, the security assertion markup language, which is HTML for security, with two-factor authentication. So everybody now uses that with Facebook and Gmail, right? If you change your password or log in on a strange device, it sends you an SMS, that kind of thing, which is another great piece of security. Also, in terms of security of your data, of not losing it, you can have redundant data centers. So if there's a catastrophic event like a gas explosion in Lebanon or a fire in California that takes out a data center, that you've got another copy of it. And then the other two columns are, one is called security in depth, which is a philosophy of securing from top to back, from the user access point through the routers to the data center and the back end to the back end of the database, that each of those layers is secure. And then you've got OWASP. So here I just give you the examples of DASO, which is good. The one place that the vendors start to differentiate is the encryption at rest and the DRM. So DASO does not encrypt the data at rest because they have it in their cloud behind their firewall. They consider that's sufficient. They don't have a DRM system out of the box. On-prem, you can use their partner Core 8 or Coastal Logic to do DRM. PTC, however, is optional. They've told me that you can actually ask for encryption of your data at rest, and they have a sort of DRM-ish solution for documentation. So that's what I'd say on security. The rest of the things are grayed out because otherwise nobody will read the full white paper. So stay tuned for that. Another aspect of security is in terms of constraints that where you're going to implement the cloud and what you're going to do with it are going to impose. So some of those constraints come from FedRAMP, which is where you put, when you're working with defense companies or government agencies, where the federal government, in particular the United States, has stringent security requirements. ITAR is an international standard of ensuring that based on where a person is physically sitting and based on their nationality, there may be data that they cannot access based on international contracts between governments and so forth. And so software has to be coded in order to ensure that someone sitting in a country like that's not authorized to access cannot access the data. I mentioned SOC 2 and ISO 27001 previously as two standards. One is by the ISO organization, another one is just by a standard accountant that can come in and check that your security is good. And also they can audit the software vendor to make sure that they're also up to spec. And lastly, for the medical devices industry in particular, you have FDA certification, where the FDA checks that the software is adequately secure, that medical information won't be leaked, or a medical device isn't going to stop in someone's heart if it's a pacemaker or something. So you've got all this whole matrix of regulatory stuff. In this case, I mentioned that, for example, FedRAMP, Autodesk doesn't really work in industries today. They don't really, at least in terms of the fusion lifecycle, they're not dealing with government agencies, so they don't have FedRAMP or ITAR. But as you can see, all the other ones, for ARAS and for ARENA, they're covered across all those things. And also same thing with Autodesk, they didn't do FDA as far as I can tell yet. No, actually they did, sorry. So everybody's got the FDA one as too. I didn't ungray it, but I would want not to mention PTC, because PTC actually has the highest level of FedRAMP, which is called IL5, Impact Level 5, which is what permitted them to win the big Navy bid that they won very, very recently. So these are just all kinds of considerations around security.
Cheers, Vinny. So, in one of the points that was brought last week in the Q&A by a number of people was around the costs of on-prem versus cloud solutions, and how much investment are people really going to have to commit to if they decide to go ahead with it.
Right. Well, there's two aspects to that. One is an economic aspect of how the cloud, particularly a SaaS approach, changes the way you're paying for things. So in traditional PLM, you purchase hardware and you depreciate it. You purchase the software, and then you purchase a PLC, a perpetual license cost for the services and so forth. And the cloud, you're basically, all the hardware is integrated into the price per user, and the PLC is also integrated in that monthly subscription. So the economic model is different. Now, since the cloud price includes the hardware, the per user cost for, say, some of the $3 billion software here will always be like a 20% delta between an on-prem user and an on cloud user, because the customer no longer needs the hardware. However, if you look over time, at one point the hardware will be depreciated, so that's not costing anything, and this will be relatively stable, whereas the cloud, typically the cost will rise over time because you'll be adding more functionality, adding more users as people get used to it. And so there's sort of a cutoff time around 4 or 5 years where the cloud could become more expensive, and in that case, the justification behind that is what we'll talk about later, is the cost of migrations upgrades, which is eliminated by going to SaaS solutions on the cloud, or just other efficiencies that you get from using the cloud. Here I show a couple examples of, say, Autodesk. So Autodesk has an on-premises solution called Vault, we'll talk about later, and their cloud solution is called Fusion Lifecycle, and they only have a SaaS cloud solution that's multi-tenant. They don't have a PaaS or an on-prem for Fusion Lifecycle, and they basically do a username license. So as you see here, there's 3 tiers. Almost all the vendors have a 3-tier system, and so you have an entry level at $325 a year, a mid-level, so with a bit more control over the data and so forth, at $965, and then the high end with access to the whole portfolio is $1935 a year. Aras is a sort of special case because they don't have a SaaS offering yet, and the software is for free. You can download it, and sorry, I didn't mention, but yeah, Fusion does have a free trial. So there's several of the other vendors. Aras is already downloadable for free. So the way that they've had success is people download it, they find it super easy to customize, they do a little internal evangelization, then people start to adopt it. However, as soon as an Aras customer, you decide you want upgrades or you want some consulting services, then you have to start paying Aras for it. You have to call them if you have less than 250 users for that price, so they don't publish that price. They do publish the fact that over 250 users is $79 per user per year, and then it's digressive as you add more and more users. So each of the vendors is a little bit different. Most of them are 3-tier. The top 3, the $1 billion club, don't publish prices, whereas almost everybody else, except for Arena, does. But anyway, that's sort of the argument on the pricing thing.
Okay, fantastic. Cheers for that. And another point that was brought up last week was around functionality and moving to the cloud. Do people lose any of that against having it on-prem?
Oh, sorry. The $78 was per month. I'm sorry, I think I read it wrong on the web, for Aras. In terms of functionality, I think we'll talk later about customization. In this case, I want to talk more about the difference between an on-prem portfolio and an on-cloud portfolio, because several of the vendors have on-prem, a managed service or a PaaS, and a SaaS offering. In the case of Autodesk, I already mentioned, they actually don't have a PaaS offering. So they just have Fusion Lifecycle, which allows you to do all your PLM stuff in the cloud. And then on-premise, you have a Vault, which is doing all the PDM, the more data management stuff. And so, no, you actually gain functionality for Autodesk on the cloud that you don't have inside Autodesk Vault. In the case of Teamcenter X, which was announced in June, they have a initial base offer called Teamcenter X Basic, which is multi-tenant and has basic BOM and change management functionality, plus a few like NX integration. And then you can do some add-ons. So that's also multi-tenant, where you add classification and a few other adapters. And then if you want something beyond that, which means the entire Teamcenter portfolio, you have to call for a quote, but then you can actually add anything else you want, and it comes in mono-tenant, but transparent to the user using Active Workspace. And so for Teamcenter, you do have access to the entire portfolio. It'll just be priced differently when you add it. And again, the rest of the vendors have other things.
Okay, fantastic. Cheers for that. And then there's another point brought up, is moving back from the cloud to on-prem? So let's say if a new management team come in and they want to, they want to change the business and then move it back to on-prem, what are the issues with that?
Well, the issue is that, well, one thing is I think you need to keep in mind is that that possibility of moving back is always going to be present. And if you go too far in the cloud and you get rid of your IT guys and all your expertise, you could be in a lot of trouble if one day you find yourself in a situation where you have to move back and you've got to rebuild the team, rebuild all the skills. So that's why it's always good to have at least keep a minimum on-prem as a backup, the vendors, it's a vendor-dependent question. For Autodesk, I use that example because again, they don't even have an on-prem solution. So there's no. I mean, they do. They have Vault, but there's no on-prem solution for Fusion Lifecycle. They do have a way, and they do allow you to export all the data from Fusion Lifecycle, so you could eventually implement that in another system. For PTC. For Windchill, they do offer a paid service of moving data from Windchill on the cloud to Windchill managed service. And you can also, at a fee, move that back to on-prem. So they do allow that as well. And they do have a possibility of exporting all the data.
Okay, fantastic. And and what about adapting SaaS onto the PLM during, based on the business needs?
Right. So this is the question of the bad word of customization versus the better word of personalization or configuration. In the past, it's been incredibly difficult to, well, it's been difficult to do customization in a multi-tenant environment in previous platforms. More recent platforms like the ones showed here have made it much easier to do so. In the case of Aras, I've already mentioned one of the reasons they've had a lot of success is because how easy it is to develop. And so with the system, you're able to create objects and attributes, create your own custom workflows and change the UI. And everything is a public REST API. And the same with OpenBOM and the Oracle Cloud. These are all really easy things to do. And the idea is that we're trying to use low code systems, so like high level scripting languages and a lot of drag and drop to avoid programmatically going in and changing data models in the database. And so that's been a relatively new paradigm, but particularly the newer vendors have picked that up. The older ones also have started doing that as well, but the newer ones have been particularly strong at ensuring that they've got a maximum amount of ways of adapting the solutions so that your business needs and your business processes are not disrupted.
Okay, all right, lovely. And there's one of the main things that I've found from talking to professionals in the industry is around upgrades. It can be a bit of a headache, can take a bit of a time and a bit of an ordeal when doing this. Does having it on the cloud alleviate any of those issues at all?
Yeah, it does. Like I said, I mean, a large amount of money is spent by companies when they need to do an upgrade of an on-prem solution, and a large amount of time as well. So that's one of the places where the cloud becomes a really interesting from a financial point of view, because you eliminate all that frustration and that time. I just give a few examples here. So Dassault Systems releases one release a year. The current release is 2021X. Every 8 to 10 weeks, they'll do an FD, functional release. And then they will, for a price, you can have a sandbox. So before the release comes out, you can test it. However, once they flip the switch and they go full on to 2021X FD02, everybody moves at the same time. So there's no way to opt out. If I take Propel as another example, Propel is based on the Salesforce platform. And so Salesforce already is doing 3 releases a year because it's a full CI, CD, or continuous integration, continuous deployment system. Every 4 to 6 weeks, there's an interim release. They do offer sandboxes. It's a standard thing of Force.com, so you can get one sandbox I think is free. I think the next ones you have to pay for them. And they also allow you for some amount of time, not forever, but some amount of time to opt out, to say, well, no, I don't want this upgrade. I'm going to wait for another release before I move up. And again, each of the vendors has a slightly different way of managing that.
Okay, fantastic. And so it seems like as the cloud alleviates a lot of the issues with upgrades, what's the case with network issues and integrations?
Okay, okay. So In this case, I wanted to use just a simple illustration. So I think there's two questions. There's one on, if my network goes away, can I still work? And is that any different from when I'm on-prem? And then how I integrate to other systems in my ecosystem. So if you think about it now in the era of COVID, we're all working from home and we're connecting through a VPN back to our servers. And so if that connection goes down from home, you're not gonna be able to work anyway, right? You're not gonna be able to get into your email system, whatever. And so that's not entirely different from the case where I'm using a cloud or multiple clouds, and I'm out here working again from home, and I'm connecting over the public internet to the cloud, and if that connection is broken, it's the same thing, right? It doesn't change that much, particularly because we're in the COVID era and people are doing remote work. Even when we were on-prem, it happened many times to me that the network would be cut, and I don't think that changed anything. And of course, if you've gotten a network, you've now lost the collaborative aspect of PLM, which we mentioned earlier in terms of CRM, which is one of the differentiators of PLM. However, we can mitigate that with the fact that with 4G networks and with the deployment of 5G networks, reliability is becoming far better on cellular networks, and everybody's got a telephone with a way of tethering to a computer, and so I think those concerns are a bit mitigated by that, right? And then some of the vendors do offer offline modes for doing CAD for a little while, so there is that. But anyway, I think that it doesn't, particularly in the era of COVID, I don't think there's a big difference there. In terms of integration, it's very vendor dependent, because you can't be exist in a vacuum. PLM has to be connected to other systems. Almost every vendor I talk to has an integration to SolidWorks. I show here Propel and Upchain both use Dassault's ePDM, which is a really light PDM that SolidWorks users really love, in order to integrate. And then a lot of people are integrating, of course, to Onshape, which was recently purchased by PTC. In terms of ECAD, Propel tells me they're working on some ECAD integrations, whereas Upchain already has 3 of them: ePlan, Promise, and AutoCAD Electrical. In terms of ERP ones, it's also very vendor dependent. In the case of Propel, since they're already on Salesforce, and Salesforce already has integrations to Oracle Manufacturing, SAP HANA, the Microsoft solutions, it's basically the same ways that you would integrate from any other Salesforce application. You would use those, and they have the Salesforce APIs plus their own Propel API, so it's really easy. In the case of Upchain, they have an alliance with MuleSoft in order to do integrations to various ERP systems, and they also have a very rich set of APIs also if you need to do that.
Okay, fantastic. Well, thank you very much for today. Some great insight again into the PLM space. We're going to throw up another poll now, just to see whether or not we've managed to alleviate any of your thoughts and issues around sort of the cloud and PLM, and then we're going to jump into a Q&A just after that. So, are you in the clouds crowd now, or are you still not in the cloud crowd, or are you on the fence and you're looking forward to episode 3 on September 24th?
Yeah, great. Thanks, guys. We were hoping it wouldn't get anybody on the second one. Awesome. That's great. Oh God, we made some converts, man. That's our next career. We have to be television evangelists. We should be richer than we are, right?
If any of you want to start popping some questions into the Q&A, please do. Just give them a couple more minutes to get a few more answers on that poll.
Okay, well, it looks great. It looks like well, at least we'll have a couple of people that will be joining next week in 2 weeks for the episode 3. That's great. Hope you will tell your friends also, and we'll have a really nice way of ending this 3-part series where we go through the PLM side before we talk about the job market and recruiting and the PLM community. Oh, that's great. I think we can end the poll there. Thanks, guys. Appreciate it. So Q&A. No questions. I think go ahead.
Quick one for this is Damien here. Just in the chat box, when you were going through one of the earlier slides, says I don't think any vendor is FDA certified. FDA certification comes from the validation of the system implementer. So I don't know if there's any clarification or commentary around that?
No,
you wanna
no,
push
they
on?
actually are. The ones I talked to actually do have FDA certification because the FDA has to check that the software doesn't have any, that it conforms to, because the FDA wants documents in a certain format and the system has to be able to out with those. It has to have traceability in order to determine if there's a defect in a particular piece that we can trace it. So there actually are audits that are done, and several of the vendors, particularly ones that act heavily in the medical arena, like Oracle, for example, actually do have FDA certification. So this FDA does certify software vendors. And again, it's sort of specific to people that want to go and do this on in the medical device field. And sometimes it can be specific. Like for Dassault, I'm fairly sure they don't have FDA certification on the cloud, but they do on the on-premises solutions, for an example. Yeah, and Johan corrected me. I think that the figure I gave for Aras was a 79. It was a 79 per month. But I'll have to double check on that. We got to have some more questions, guys.
Just give them a couple of minutes.
So I guess everything is perfectly clear.
We've done a good job.
Come on, guys. There's got to be another question. Boy, last week we had tons of questions. What's going on? Mark is raising his hand. Well, I'll let Mark talk. Okay, Mark, what's up? I think your mic is off.
Okay.
There you go. We can hear you. How you doing?
I'm doing okay. Yeah, so we just did our own webinar and asked a bunch of questions about cloud adoption. Yeah, we've observed that while cloud adoption is very high for CRM and also for general communications purposes and back office functions like email, etc., that in the areas of asset performance management, manufacturing execution systems, and PLM, the uptick has been a little bit modest and we did some more research on it, and I think maybe I'm reinforcing some of the comments that you made, but there has been so much investment in the on-premise PLM where processes have been evolved and been cultivated for more than 20 years. It's hard for customers to depart from those environments for cloud PLM infrastructure, notably native cloud PLM infrastructure, that is, I'd say, relatively immature and has not really been fine-tuned for their processes. Certainly, also other concerns about the integration between on-premise and cloud applications, I think has been an issue. That's part of it. And from a cost point of view, my observation is that when procurement people are looking at the cost of cloud, they're looking at the IT costs, but not necessarily balancing that with the reduction in needed spend on infrastructure and resources.
Right.
So, they look at the slice of the cost in IT, but not counterbalancing that with where they're going to save money overall. Maybe it's different cost centers. I'm not quite sure on that, but I just wanted to share that perspective.
Thanks, Mark. Yeah, I think part of that also is it's people have, well, because it's such a painful subject, I'm not sure that people realize the cost of upgrades and patching, because that's just so expensive and so time consuming. And I don't know if it gets rolled up as an annual cost, you know what I mean? And so that would be an obvious one where you'd save 6 to 8 months just by not having to do that anymore.
Yes. Also, yeah, I had to leave for a little bit of your session. Did you talk about issues of private cloud versus multi-tenant cloud and some of the concerns of of end users being in multi-tenant environments?
I touched on it briefly. I think that there's concerns of like data leakage from tenant to tenant sometimes, and yet I think the vendors have been fairly good about ensuring that. It also, multi-tenant has different variants, right? You could really be fully multi-tenant where everything is split down the line, or where just some components are multi-tenant and other ones aren't. Like I was giving the example of Teamcenter X, where the base and add-ons are multi-tenant environments, but when you add other functionality from the Teamcenter portfolio, it comes in as mono-tenant.
Mm-hmm.
And then the private cloud versus public cloud. Yeah, I forgot to mention, I wanted to put a plug there too, because I talked to a friend of mine. There's a platform from HP called GreenLake, which is basically an on-premise SaaS cloud. So I think I also neglected to mention earlier that you can also have a SaaS cloud on-premise in your data center. HP has it such that you can do workloads in your data center on GreenLake, and then GreenLake knows how to outsource those into Amazon and then if necessary, bring those back and then re-execute them. And then it's just a contractual change if you suddenly need to recuperate your things from the cloud and run in your own data center.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think that maybe sometimes we forget that cloud doesn't always mean it's not in my data center. It's just a new economic model, a new way of accessing the applications, right?
Sure. All right. I'm
Cool.
sure we could continue this discussion for a while. I have to drop off for another obligation,
Thanks,
but
Mark.
thank you for the opportunity
Cheers, Mark.
for joining today.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Okay.
We've had a couple of questions come in as well,
Great. Okay.
One from Johan. So it says that many PLM projects require system integrations, including legacy systems using ETL tools, which are mostly on-premise.
Yeah.
Will we have to wait for many legacy systems to be replaced before moving PLM to the cloud?
Not necessarily. Sometimes, particularly in private cloud. So Mark brought up the point of private cloud. I'm fairly sure the other vendors offer something similar. Francois already corrected me that, well, let me remember the FDA question. Francois Lamy of PDC said that it actually is it's not the FDA auditing the vendor and PDC, but it's the FDA auditing the customer that's using the software. But the same auditor can make sure the software is conforming to FDA. So semantically, it's not exactly FDA certifying, but it's the fact that there has been an audit that's made it FDA compatible. To answer your question on private cloud, in the case of DS private cloud, the way that works is basically the same thing as the public cloud, except you've got a dedicated environment, so it's mono-tenant, and they give you a VPN. So the private cloud looks like an extension of your data center. So those ETL tools will work because they're already behind the VPN. So I'd say that for those ETL tools, they would probably need to be in a private cloud, an analogous situation like Dassault has with their private cloud. I believe that several of the vendors like PTC, I believe they offer something similar. Yeah, I think that's what I wanted to say there. I know also that Dassault is working on putting a piece of Biovia called Pipeline Pilot into the cloud so that they have their own ETL that's cloud-based as well. I'm not sure if that made it in the portfolio yet or not. Maybe someone from PT will tell me about that one. I think that Yas is talking about hybrid environments are the new trend. I totally agree with that. As I said, I think that customers, it would be pretty scary if you were just to drop everything and move everything into cloud, because if you ever have to move anything back, it's going to cost you a year or two to recruit another team, buy the machines, bring everything back in-house. And so indeed, I think that hybrid systems of having, say, new projects on the cloud and keeping the legacy on-prem, gradually integrating those two is maybe a way to go. I know that, for example, Teamcenter has a very flexible federation system where you can federate several team centers and use Active Workspace to make it look like a single instance in order to make that experience for the user a little bit more transparent. And I believe Windchill's able to do that too with the ThingWorks Navigator to a degree. So yeah, I totally agree. I think that it would be hard to imagine a system where we only had everything only on the cloud. I think at one point everybody's going to have a system that's a hybrid, and therefore the fact of having open APIs and alliances with companies like MuleSoft, like I'm still showing on the site here for Upchain, is really helpful for achieving those integrations.
Okay, and so there's a question come from Yasin as well about having 3D files which are slightly larger. Would it be quicker to have them on-prem for uploading?
Well, yeah, that was saying that definitely. Well, depending on the size, right? If it's 20 megs, it's probably not a big deal. But you're looking at 300 or 400 meg assembly with hundreds of thousands of parts. Yeah, you're going to want that on-prem. And like for Autodesk, you've got Autodesk Vault. That's the way it works the default. You keep all the files on site, and you just do the PLM on the top. Many of the vendors do offer replication where you have a real file server on that's then connected via software to the cloud. It does oblige you to do to have a VPN there in order to get through to the on-site network, or you can also use Amazon. If the company's on Amazon or Azure, you can also move the data vendor dependent, but you can move the data to a data center that's closer to where the user is, so that the penalty of latency and bandwidth is mitigated. Yeah, I think that's, I mean, the trick on-prem was doing that, and sometimes in order to accelerate the web side, to use a network WAN accelerators. Those don't always work great with CAD because WAN accelerators work on patterns, repeatable patterns and the URLs, and the CAD files are typically going to be unique every single time. And so, yeah, eventually, that's another case, I think, to underline what Yas was saying in terms of every solution will be hybrid. They will, for cases where you're using really heavy CAD models, you're always going to have, most likely going to need an on-prem system to hold those files, right?
We've just had another question coming from Andy as well. Thank you again for joining us this week. So some companies have a high level of requirement in terms of computer-aided engineering, and to cope with this already have large storage and CPU.
Yes.
How could that affect the balance on site as opposed to SaaS?
Good question. So you're talking about basically this whole simulation field, right? It depends on the vendor. I'll talk a little bit more about that next week. The vendors are trying to use the cloud for burst computing. I think I mentioned Greenfield, so HP already has that sort of natively built into this particular machine where it natively knows how to burst into a cloud. The different vendors support it different ways. I know TeamSerX has a few pieces of the portfolio that can be burst computed onto the cloud. Dassault just recently introduced cloud computing credits, so that the hardware, because before you had to buy tokens in advance, that was just the calculations that done by the software, and separately you had to buy the hardware in order to do the calculations, which became just obsessively expensive. And they just recently, in at least the last FD, they released compute credits where the hardware is included, and they don't go back into a pool. You use them, but they're not incredibly expensive, which allows for that. So each of the vendors has their own strategy for enabling that, but it's definitely something, particularly the $3 billion vendors are very, very aggressive of trying to use the cloud for that. I think there was an angle to that question on deciding that I wouldn't go on cloud because of that, and I guess it would be vendor dependent. If your vendor doesn't support burst computing and isn't allowing you to use that elasticity of the cloud in order to improve, to eliminate the fact of having humongous machines in the data center, then yeah, that's going to be a deciding choice. But I think all the vendors are very aggressively trying to enable burst computing with their out-of-the-box software.
Cheers for that. There's another question coming from Atul. We possibly might have covered some of this during the webinar. So many organizations have complex business processes involving multiple domains. These processes also require different levels of customization to meet the customer requirements. So how customizations impact on cloud adoptions?
Well, the more modern ones have been able to do well. Taken the model where the customers they've modularized the platform, so there's a data model on the bottom, you have a sort of business process layer, and then you have the UI. And when you're making modifications, you're trying not to ever touch that data layer on the bottom, and so you're able to make changes. That the reason why customization has been a 4-letter word. Configuration. Yeah, I guess it's even a 4-syllable word, but it's also a 4-letter word because in the past, yes, you've done a customization, and then when you upgraded, you lost the customization or it broke everything. In the new world of the more modern PLM, particularly because of multi-tenant, because of the fact that most of the vendors want to have a multi-tenant system because it's far more profitable. And yet, if I make a change for one tenant, I don't want to change the code for all the other ones. They've come up with ways, and I think Salesforce might, and probably Arena were the most advanced in that, and allowing changes that were important for customers to implement business processes that didn't affect the underlying data model and the way the platform works, so that customers could get adapt the platform to what they need without breaking everything else. So that's one of the features of modern PLMs, basically.
Fantastic. Cheers for that. If you've got any more questions, we'll give you guys another couple of minutes to pop some in the box for us. We'll wrap up in a moment.
Oh, Francois Lamy also wanted me to mention that there will be cloud computing for generative design in Creo coming in this November. So, so there'll be some more activity in terms of utilizing the cloud for AI and general design from the guys at PTC relatively soon. And I think you're going to see that with all the vendors, because it's obviously economically super interesting to be able to do that. In fact, next week, anyway, we're going to talk about the strengths of cloud. We're going to talk about the cloud vendors, and we're going to talk about the future of cloud. So I will talk a little bit about how AI is going to impact PLM, because that's really generative design. There's a lot of AI in there. So I'll talk about that next time. September 24th, right?
24th? Yeah.
Yep.
Doesn't look like we've got any more questions coming in.
Well, I hope everybody enjoyed this. I hope you guys had a good time and it was worth your time.
Yeah, so cheers, guys. So as Fiona said, we're going to be covering advantages and more specifics on some of the vendors next week, or in 2 weeks' time, sorry, on the 25th. So hopefully, 24th, sorry. So hopefully we'll see you all again in a couple of weeks' time.
Yeah, I hope so too. Have a great day, everybody. And
cheers, guys.
And thanks again for joining. Talk to you soon. Cheers.